Hello, welcome to Chattanooga Chills Ghost Stories. I'm going to be your host, Mark Fults. We are now in a cemetery that is nestled in the beautiful hills of St. Elmo, and one of my favorite old stomping grounds. And I wanted today to share some stories with you that when I was young, they meant a lot to me. And got me inspired to do the work that I'm doing now in writing books, collecting ghost stories, collecting local legends, history, um, all of the above. But when I was a child, uh, my grandmother, Laura Swearingen, who is my mother's mother, was very psychic, and she also had a great amount of ghost stories that I love to hear. And in the Victorian period, because of Charles Dickens' Christmas Carol, which is a ghost story, people began to tell ghost stories at Christmas time, and it became a tradition. So when I was very young, one Christmas evening, when I was about 15, 16, we were around the fireplace, because I actually grew up in a place with a fireplace. And we told ghost stories on Christmas Eve for about 3 hours. And it was one of the most enjoyable Christmas Eves that I can remember. And you wouldn't think so, but it brings an intimacy that you just wouldn't expect, because you're around the fire, you're telling stories, you're interested, you're sometimes a little scared, a little anxious, and it's a lot of fun. It's very safe entertainment and very enjoyable. So hopefully some of the stories that I will tell you today you will take and make them part of your stories that you tell on Christmas Eve around the fire. The first story that I'm going to tell is one my grandmother used to repeat, I'm going to call it The Night Caller. This is a story of a woman, her name Helen. It was in about the 40s. Her husband had just died from a prolonged illness, and the day that they buried him, it began storming terribly. Sheets of rain, lightning, thunder. So after the funeral was over and all the guests had left and all the mourners had gone home, Helen went home exhausted, got ready, went to bed. She was just ready to pass out for days. And she had gone to sleep, and somewhere in the evening, the phone rang and woke her up. It was still just lightning and thunder and just horrible weather. And she answered the phone. Hello. And there was this very strange voice on the other end. It sounded very far away. And it said, Helen, come get me. I want to come home. And she thought it was a prank call, so she told them to leave her alone, and she hung up. A few minutes later, the phone rang again. She answered, and again, this very strange voice said, Helen, come get me. It's cold. It's dark. I want to come home. So she screamed, put the phone down, thought somebody was pulling a very cruel prank. Again, the phone rings. didn't want to answer it, but for some reason she couldn't keep herself from it. So she answers the phone and says, "Who are you? What do you want?" And the voice said, "I want to come home. Please come get me. It's cold. It's wet. It's dark." And then she began to realize it was her husband's voice. The husband they had just buried this afternoon. So she screams, throws the phone down, runs to the car, races across town to the cemetery, jumps out of the car, runs across the cemetery looking for the grave that she had just been in front of just a few hours before. And she finds his grave, freshly dug, freshly finished. And his grave was very close to the road. When she got up close to the grave, she looked up and had seen that a tree had been knocked down during the electrical storm. And it had knocked down a telephone pole. And the telephone wires were knocked down, and lying across her husband's grave and tombstone was a telephone wire. So her husband had been calling from beyond the grave. Now that one, if told well, can put the chills on anybody. Now, the next story I have is a little different. Back in the 1890s, the process of embalming had become widespread, but it still, a lot of places just didn't do it. If you died, you had to be buried within 48 hours. This woman had died unexpectedly. They buried her. During the funeral, the caretaker had seen she was being buried with a great deal of jewelry. So he helped bury the lady, made sure all the mourners had gone home, and the caretaker went away, got a friend, and came back at night and was going to dig her up and get that jewelry. So they dug up her grave, opened the casket. There she is, laid out. There's several $1,000s in necklaces, rings. So he's able to get everything except this ring that he really wants. So he can't get it off her finger. So he breaks out a pocket knife, begins to cut her finger because he's going to cut it off and get the ring the easiest way. And as soon as he breaks the skin, the woman sits up and says, "What do you think you're doing?" So the grave robbers scream and jump out of the grave and run off. So she sits up, looks around, realizes she's in a grave, climbs out of the grave, walks a couple of miles back to her home, begins knocking on the windows and doors, trying to get her husband to let her in. Of course, he's not going to let her in. He just buried her. And eventually, he let her in. They had a doctor come over, and they realized she had been in a coma. And actually, the grave robber had saved her life. So they put an ad in the paper as a reward for that. They would give the reward with no questions asked, but no one ever came to claim it. So that is a story of a different type. Now, one from this area that I'm not quite sure that it's a ghost story, but it's an interesting story. There was this 16-year-old girl who was killed in a car wreck. And they had buried her. And in a couple of days, they found the body had been dug up and molested. And they had no idea who would do this, why they would do this. Then about a week later, a young man comes to the emergency room with this incredible case of blood poisoning. And they got out of him that him and a friend had known the girl, and kind of as a ritual thing, they had dug her up, molested the body, done a ritual. And he had blood poisoning from the embalming fluid from the girl. So, and there was a boy that had helped him. And within the next 2 weeks, both of those boys died screaming in agony. There was nothing they could do for them. They died terrible deaths from molesting the dead. So she had her revenge from beyond the grave. Just slightly. Now, Chattanooga is, of course, a very old place. We have the area we're in right now is, of course, my old stomping grounds. The Civil War came right through the center, down the roads here. Just a lot of history that in these areas, the Missionary Ridge around here, the end of the Revolutionary War was finished here. The Indians were here. The mound builders were here. The Mississippians were here. So we have just layer upon layer upon layer of unusual energy that can create phenomena. Sometimes it's active, sometimes it's recorded, sometimes it's just like a record. It just gets energy that gets kicked off by a certain activity, certain circumstances, and it will make things happen. Now, the house I lived in St. Elmo, near 51st Street and St. Elmo Avenue, it was about 114 years old. Now, of course, I always try to find a house that has ghosts because I think it has character, and of course, I just like it. We'd found this house 15 years ago. It had some activity, but it was very rare. But we had a lot of phenomena where there would be this old man who was very disheveled looking. And it seemed to happen when we were getting ready for parties or doing something or building something or doing crafts. This spirit, this old man, would come to the front window and look in. Then he would go around the house, and then you would start hearing something in the basement kicking the doors and making noise. So the old man kind of looked like somebody from the Civil War. So I have a friend named Jerry Harvey, and one time he was over with me at the house, and we were sitting in the front room doing some crafts, and all of a sudden he goes, "Who's that?" And I said, "What?" And he goes, "There's this old man looking in the window." And I said, "It's okay." He says, No, he went around the house." So Jerry went out, chased around the house, looking for this old man, came back, and then I had to inform him, he had seen our resident Civil War ghost. And took him a while to accept that. But, and Jerry's involved in several ghost stories I've got to tell. But the noise of the kicking in the basement, we never could really figure that one out until someone who used to live there with their grandmother came by, and I think their family name was Carver. And they came by and said in the 70s, they had gotten a Shetland pony. And you really couldn't have a Shetland pony downtown. So they would hide that Shetland pony in the basement and at night ride it around the neighborhood. So the horse would be kicking the door and stuff like that. So it was still, that was a replay of that energy when we'd hear that noise. Now, the old house was split into like a duplex. And an old friend of mine that I used to take care of, Judith, lived on one side, I lived on the other. And she had a spirit she had brought with her from Indiana that I didn't care for, that I made her keep on her side of the house. And a while back, she had to be hospitalized. So anytime she had to leave the house for any period of time, this male spirit would be on her side at the door going, Judith, Judith. You know, so, or speaking or doing stuff. So my friend Carrie came over one day and we were sitting in the front room again. And he heard someone in the kitchen go, hey! And he goes, Mark, Judith is calling you from the kitchen. I said, and I ignored it. I said, don't worry about it. And did it again. And he goes, you're just being rude. Why don't you go answer her? And I said, there isn't anyone here. That's her thing on the other side calling for her. And so, of course, he had to go through the house and checked it and scared him to death. And the last time it did it to me, I was going through the hallway about 3 in the morning, and it goes, Judith. And so I went, shut up and stay on your side. And so when I moved, when she went her way, I went my way. Hopefully it went with her, but if not, somebody's buying that house with an extra guest that they'll be experiencing lots of fun with. Now, Jerry Harvey, once again, features in a ghost story. He took me to a hospital in Fort Oglethorpe. And we went into this abandoned part of the hospital that's supposed to be haunted by a nurse named Nora. Because she goes in, takes people's temperatures, and talks to them. But she's old-fashioned, has an old-fashioned nurse's cape, old-fashioned hat. And they'll ask about the nurse, and the nurses think they're nuts. So he took me to this place. We went up to the abandoned part. And it's a long hallway with a big chapel-looking room. And we were there in the dark. And I did a spiritualist call to make it where I could communicate with the spirits. And in the dark, it was like somebody reached up and pulled a zipper, opening a zipper. And it was this little sliver of light started coming into the room. And you could see people coming in and out of that light. I thought it was quite beautiful. It was very unusual. So I told Jerry, and he had a female friend with him that had come along for the ride. And I got them to come up close to see what I was seeing. And they both saw this girl's ghost peek around the corner. And when they did, he knocked me over, jumped over my body, ran out the door, dragging her behind him. I looked out the windows and saw this glassed-in staircase that went all the way to the parking lot. And I could see him going down three flights of stairs, running out to the parking lot, and he didn't stop until he got into his car. So with Jerry, I figured out anytime I go ghost hunting, I have to make sure he keeps a distance of at least 6 feet, because I will get knocked over, anything else. So, because he gets scared, and he's a runner. But he also adds a lot of elements of fun to a ghost hunt. Downtown Chattanooga, of course, has gone through many, many, many changes. where Cameron Hill is, where the Blue Cross building is, that used to be a huge, huge mound. And at the foot of it was an actual burial mound from that I think they figured was about 2,000 or 3,000 years old. And when the Civil War broke out, they built a fort on the mound called, and after the Civil War, when people began to really build and come in, the rich people built beautiful mansions on the hill. The mansions were on the front, and on the back were the shanties where the servants lived to take care of the mansions. And there was a incline that went up the hill to a casino that was up there in the 1800s, and very beautiful, spectacular place. And during the early part of last century, before they began to cut into Cameron Hill, they scraped the mound that is there off into the river. And they figured that they scraped the remains of about 20,000 Indians into the riverside. And they'd found things like a copper crown. My grandfather, who was a construction worker in that period, who did other sites in Chattanooga, said people would just follow behind the bulldozers picking up bones and pottery and things like that, and considered it like finding, treasure, instead of realizing, they were picking up fragments of burial grounds. And Cameron Hill was always kind of considered cursed. And it had its mansions. They were beautiful. Eventually, they began to go downhill, and in the 60s, against thousands of people's wishes, they tore all the mansions down, cut the hill in half. And then after that, they keep continuing cutting it down until it's just nothing really now. It has the Blue Cross building on it, but there were stories of some of the mansions up there that were haunted. There was one where a lady who was a servant, it was in the late 1800s, early 1900s. She took care of a rich lady there. And when the lady had died, someone had stolen a great deal of jewelry, silverware, and they blamed the servant. And she lived across on the shanty side. So they were coming to her to lynch her. And she ran in that house, looking around, trying to find something to prove her innocence. And they came and dragged her out and hung her. And after that, the house became very haunted. People would hear the door would slam open. You'd hear someone up going through all the drawers and all the things. And it was the ghost trying to find the evidence to prove her innocence. And eventually, they found the jewelry that had been hidden by a relative who was coming back to steal it. And, of course, they didn't hang her. But once they had solved it and cleared her name, then the haunting stopped. But the things from the hill, when they scraped off the mound into the river, there are many, many legends about caves. That there's a hidden cave that a man said he found 12 mummies sitting in a sitting position in a circle, one with a crown. Things like that. Just all sorts of strange little stories. But where they scraped off the mound is very close to Ross's Landing, and very close to that, near the bridge, is a memorial fountain that is built in stair steps down to the river, and it has names of different Indian cultures that were here. Well, the Indians that were from the mound were different than the ones that they are listing on the steps, and so it kind of angered them, and they have a terrible time getting the stair step fountain to work, and apparently they had to just give up. But it's because they have rival Indian groups on the memorial with them. So they need to go down and cleanse that and do that. But that is, I believe, from the Indian spirits. Near that is where the Hunter Art Museum is. At one time, the cliff was covered with Victorian mansions and cottages. And I think it was like 1907, somewhere around there. There was a lady named Augusta Hoffman who lived there, who was worked as a seamstress at a large store here. At that time, women were still wearing corsets and had to have special blouses made, and skirts and everything had to be created because there wasn't a whole lot of store-bought goods. You had to have a lot of things made. And that was her business, and she also had money. And she had a nephew and his wife that had hit hard times, and they borrowed about $2,000 from her, which was a huge amount of money at that time. And they could not pay it back. She wouldn't let them forget it. So she decided to move in on them for rent to get back to be paid back for the money that she was owed. And apparently they resented her. And at one point, the last anyone had seen of Augusta, she was supposed to have gone seen her sister in Knoxville. And she just disappeared. And the couple had moved into Augusta's old house. People were talking about this terrible smell that was there for 6 months. And they would just say, oh, it's this, it's this, it's the septic, it's this, it's, and so they got around it. So about 10 years later, someone found Augusta's skeleton under the floor. And her nephew and his wife were arrested and charged, and it became an international trial. And but because the evidence was they felt like it was circumstantial, they were able to get off from the murder charges. But Augusta was still, her ghost was haunting. And when they tore down the cottages and the mansions to make a parking lot for the Hunter Art Museum, her mansion, which was on the parking lot area, just moved into the Hunter Art Museum. And 20 years ago, I went and investigated. And when she appears to a lot of people, she looks very bloody, very bludgeoned. And when she appeared to me, she was neat, tidy, dressed very ladylike, didn't want to address those issues. But she still haunts the Hunter Art Museum. And there are several ghosts in the Hunter Art Museum, but she's one that she didn't live there, but she wanted to live in the house, so she just moved in there. And a few years ago, there was a friend of mine, Ann Rains. She knew someone that had gone into the place before she'd heard our story, and Augusta Hoffman had been buried under the floor at the place she had been murdered at. Well, the woman came into the Hunter Art Museum and went up to the curator and said, I'm sensitive. I see this woman who's coming out from underneath the floor here. So she's been reported. She lives there, but she's not destructive or scary, but she is still known to live in the Hunter.